Hi, I'm David Hornbuckle, and if you're watching this, I'm probably your teacher and probably have assigned you a comparative analysis to write. So here's some tips and tricks on what to do with that.
Hornbuckle's Rockin' Literature Classes.
So a comparative analysis, also known as the compare and contrast essay, is sometimes a little tricky, especially for freshman writers or sophomore writers, what have you. But there are basically two approaches you can take. The first one is you can take two things that are similar in some obvious ways, but different in some ways that are interesting. So the apples to apples type of argument. The other approach you might take is to find two things that are different in some obvious ways, but similar in some ways that are interesting. This I'll call the apples and oranges type of argument. Whichever one you're doing, whether it's apples to apples or apples to oranges, you want to briefly acknowledge the obvious characteristics, whether those are the differences or the similarities, and then spend the majority of the essay talking about what's interesting. So if you're comparing two short stories by the same author and on similar topics, the similarities are obvious. You want to acknowledge that briefly at the beginning of your essay. If you have a short story and a poem, and they're both written 100 years apart, maybe one's by a British writer, one's by an American writer, those differences are obvious. So in that case, you want to point that out early on. But then you want to analyze what's interesting, and that's going to be the bulk of your essay. So maybe in those two similar short stories, the author ends up seeming to make a theme statement in one story that's the opposite of the theme in the other story, right? Maybe he was anti-war in one story, but then the other one written 10 years later, he seems to be pro-war. Or maybe the story and the poem have a very similar theme, despite differences of time, place, and genre. So that's interesting, and you want to spend the most of your time in the essay talking about that. The similarities and differences should matter. This is key. It's your job as a writer to explain why these characteristics are important. So let's just take, for example, the case of the story and the poem that I mentioned before, written 100 years apart on different continents. Let's say they both have an anti-war message, and that's the interesting thing you want to focus on. Well, you'll need to make sure you find evidence from each text that'll show that there is indeed an anti-war message that's similar. And you also want to talk about, well, what is the impact that the obvious differences in time, place, and genre may have on the interpretation of that similar anti-war message. So let's talk a little bit about how you might structure this essay. Similar to other essays you might write, if you've written other essays for me, some of this should be very familiar. You always start by introducing your subject, no matter what your essay is about. In this case, in the comparative analysis, you'll want to say something about each work of literature you will discuss. You want to be sure to mention the title and full name of each author at some point in that introduction. You'll probably want to include a 1 or 2 sentence summary of each piece. And then, of course, you want to end the intro section with a thesis statement that outlines what your argument is. Now let's just zoom in on that thesis statement for a minute. Again, acknowledge the obvious and then put focus on the interesting. So here's an example. Though both of these works are by the same author and on the same topic, they are written at different points in his career and seem to indicate a shift in attitude from pro-war to anti-war. So notice in the first part of that sentence, I acknowledge the obvious. By the same author, on the same topic. But then I'm going to put focus at the end of the sentence on the interesting thing, that there seems to be a shift in this author's attitude from work A to work B. The other example, and this would be the apples and oranges type of essay, though these works were written worlds and a century apart, obvious difference, they both have a similar anti-war message that resonates today. After your thesis statement, start a new paragraph. This is where you want to go a little bit more in depth on the obvious. Not too much. There may not be a lot more you can say about the obvious similarities or differences, but you should take a short paragraph to develop those ideas a little more. Talk about why they matter. Ask yourself what impact these obvious traits may have on the more interesting traits that you'll discuss later. So just give a little bit more detail about those obvious things that you're not going to spend too much time on. So then you're going to get into the main part of your essay, which is going to focus on the interesting. Focus on the interesting traits. You might have one big one. You might have 3 or 4. It all depends on what your assignment is, the required length, and especially on what it will take to prove your thesis statement. But structurally, there are two options. You can either fully cover one work, usually 2 or 3 paragraphs, and then shift to the other work for another 2 or 3 paragraphs. Or you can go back and forth between the two. Paragraph on work A, paragraph on work B, paragraph on work A, paragraph on work B. Typically, if you're going to use that first method, discussing full work A, then full work B, this works best if you're going to discuss different characteristics for each work. So for example, both have a similar theme, but work A is a poem that relies mainly on figurative language and symbolism, while work B is a story that relies on characterization and plot to make its point. So then you might have a paragraph that talks about figurative language in the poem, a paragraph that talks about symbolism in the poem, then transition into the story, talk about characterization in one paragraph, and then talk about plot in a paragraph. The back and forth method works best if you're discussing the same characteristics in each work. For example, metaphors in work A, metaphors in work B, symbolism in work A, symbolism in work B. And so this works out nicely balanced if you do the back and forth method. If you've written essays for me before, you know that I asked for you to use the AEC paragraph structure. I've got another video that's fully on this, but I'm just going to go through it briefly. AEC stands for assertion, evidence, and commentary. So your assertion makes a claim about your topic that relates to the thesis statement. This is where you'll say, for example, one way Hemingway makes his point in the story is through his use of symbolism. Symbolism is the topic in this example, so it needs to be mentioned up front. That's why we sometimes call the assertion a topic sentence. Assertion is another word for a topic sentence. I like it better than topic sentence because it's more descriptive of what you're actually doing, which is making a claim. After your assertion, you have evidence. It should be evidence that backs up the claim you just made. And your quote that you use should include context. So this may include a speaker, a listener, and a plot clue. The plot clue gives a reader some orientation to help understand, well, where in the story or poem does this happen? For example, after escaping to North Mountain, Elsa says to Anna, I belong here alone where I can be who I am without hurting anybody. The plot clue is after escaping to North Mountain because it tells us what's going on in the story at the point when Elsa says this. Elsa is the speaker. So we know, okay, who says this quote? Is it a main character? Is it the narrator? Some other character? She says it to Anna, so that way we know who she's saying it to. She's not saying it to herself. She's not saying it directly to the reader. So all of that provides some context to help us understand the quote that you're using for your evidence. And the commentary explains your reasoning. It shows how the evidence proves the assertion you made at the beginning of the paragraph. Your commentary should be about half of your paragraph. So probably for each piece of evidence that you have, 2 sentences of commentary is usually sufficient. For any one claim or assertion, you should try to have at least 2 pieces of evidence with commentary after each one. So then you end up with a paragraph structure that looks like this: assertion, evidence, commentary, second piece of evidence, second chunk of commentary. Now, conclusions are notoriously hard, and there are several ways to approach them. What I always recommend to my students is it's a good idea to come around again to why the argument you've made matters. Why should readers care about this? To make this point, you might make a connection between the works you're discussing and current events or universal ideas or something of that nature, right? Expand your argument, expand the ideas. So hopefully this was helpful if you were trying to write this type of essay and you need some direction. And that's it for today. I'll see you later.